Well, it's not as bad as the, what's the other population that's gone crazy? The, can't think of
Gypsy
it.
moth.
No,
The gypsy moths.
Lantern
No.
fly.
no, it's every 17 years. I can't think of their names.
Oh, cicadas.
Cicadas
Cicadas.
are noisy, but those little moths, I assume, are toxic.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
The cicadas aren't.
you're right.
Yeah, but they're quite, went down south and they were unbelievable, the noise the cicadas were making. Thank goodness they were not pervasive.
We have a severe problem in our area with the woolly agilid, I think it's called.
Only adelgid in the hemlocks, yes.
Yeah, our condo is next to a wooded area, and we're having an application to get rid of them because they're quite prolific. And the emerald ash borer also is prevalent in the state of Maine now. It's all come up from places like New Jersey. I wonder if we could sue the state of New Jersey for
Yeah, you
that.
have to-
Good luck with that.
Actually, they came from Asia.
Yeah,
From Asia.
along with green clams or green crabs, excuse me. Lots of invasive species.
Yep.
So we have Helen and Cindy and Mickey and Susan and Linda on. Hello, everybody.
Hi there. Hi.
Hi.
If I leave, it's because we've lost power.
Well, we hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, we're in a tornado watch, so
Oh
Right, I
my.
heard that. I heard
Yeah.
that they gave up the watch, but this is severe weather.
yeah, well, up in Ringwood, it's a little bit longer. I don't trust it.
I used to
Okay.
live just north of Bergen County. I lived
Recording in progress.
in Valley.
Well, you're familiar.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
So welcome, everyone. We're coming up on 7:30 in a moment. We'll take a couple more minutes before I introduce Matt Goldfarb, and he begins his 3-week series, the first in 3 Mondays on anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And I know he'll be doing that from starting out with a historic point of view right away. I will ask everyone to mute themselves. And I will ask that if you would like to ask a question, by all means, put it in chat, and I'll forward it to Matt as we go through the program. I will be sharing, Matt has a couple of videos picked out that he wants to share a couple segments, and I'm going to try to be the IT person for that. So you hope you have a little patience as I try to make that come to life, but they are queued up, ready to go. So that's the good news. Something from South Pacific and something from Simon Chikma's The Story of the Jews. So Matt has added some different pieces to highlight his conversation tonight, his dialogue. He looks forward to everyone who would like to participate to do that. And so this can be a dialogue, not just a soliloquy, if you will, or a total lecture, because as Matt said, he doesn't want to put anybody to sleep. So have a drink nearby, a fan if you're hot, and you know, by all means, look forward to this. So this is the Temple Israel series of programs on a variety of topics and subjects. We're fortunate to have with us tonight Matt Goldfarb, the famous father of our temple president, James Goldfarb. And a little nepotism never hurt. So we're delighted that Matt, who is way up north in Cumberland, Maine, is joining us through the wizardry of virtual connections. And we'll all get to see him and hear from him about his study. I'll introduce Matt in a second and let you know that he'll be sharing his background and the reason that he's put his efforts into this expertise to share this important topic. Because in every generation, door to door. It's important for us to know about anti-Semitism so that we can be prepared to pass that along to the next generation so that perhaps they can be wary of it and know what to do if something occurs. So Matt, welcome this evening. We're at about 7:31, 7:32. I'm sure more people will join us along the way, and they'll be happy to join in at a later point. And I wanted to turn it over to you and say welcome, and we're looking forward to a very interesting hour about anti-Semitism. So good evening and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. It's a pleasure to speak before this group. I was asked by Joanna a little earlier as to, why I kind of do this type of thing. And the quick answer is simply about 10 years ago, my wife and I traveled to the Salzburg Music Festival. And en route, we stopped for a couple of days in Innsbruck. And very close to the ski jump that they use for the Olympics is a museum which was brand new. It wasn't even on the agenda of the people who were telling us what tourists ought to do. And this museum, I think, had been open less than 6 months and was supposed to exemplify and extol the Tyrolean lifestyle, because Innsbruck is located close to the border with Germany and Switzerland. So we actually took the elevator up to the ski, ski jump, and I looked, to the east, and lo and behold, there was a new building, and I said, well, let's take a walk over there. Let's see what that is. And as we got closer, we saw it was a museum, so we said, let's go in. And this was a very nice display about the culture of the people in the Tyrol, their winter sports, summer sports, how people earned a living. They had a panorama, much like the one at Gettysburg, which showed a very famous battle where the local farmers, like our Minutemen, pushed back Napoleon's troops. And as we went through it, there was an interactive part where you could use a clicker like you would use for a television set. And as you went to, say, 10 kiosks, you would click something on and there would be a voice recording describing a particular feature of life in the Tyrol. Well, the very last one was about ritual murder. I said, well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what that's about. So I clicked on, and it told a story about an incident that occurred in 1462 in the town of Rinn, R-I-N-N. And it had to do with blood libel. And the blood libel essentially was soft-pedaled. The word Jew was not mentioned. And there was no information about the slander that Jews had killed a Christian child to get the child's blood. And I grew very angry at that. And I said, well, if this is what the local folks think is a teaching of history, I've got a different view about it. And I decided that I would become better informed. So I've been essentially just a reader of history, of Jewish history in particular, and anti-Semitism is something which I thought that I should address in my later years. And that's really what my background is, or expertise. I was formerly the chairman of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation and United Jewish Appeal of Southern Maine. And at the ripe old age of 83, I still teach at senior college at the University of Southern Maine. And I'm pleased to make a presentation to you tonight, which will cover a vast sweep of history going back to ancient times. I encourage you to ask questions. I don't know what your level of reading experience. I suspect that any Jewish group of people has stories about what they have themselves experienced. I thought that I would start by reading a couple of op-ed pieces just to break the ice and maybe to plant some themes or ideas in your heads. And then I'm going to ask you folks, if you'd be kind enough, tell me, what would you like to know? And over the course of the 3 programs, I hope to address each of your questions. So let me start by reading an op-ed piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal on May 11, 2018. It was presented by Professor Reuven Brenner, who at that time was the holder of the Repap Chair at McGill University, Faculty of Management. And the thoughts he expressed were drawn on a 1983 book of his called History, The Human Gamble, and also a 2016 speech at the John Paul II Institute in Warsaw. So I offer this to you just as a means of, shall we say, putting out some thoughts and ideas that perhaps will spur some impulses in you to say, I'd like to know more about this or that or whatever. So let me begin. 70 years after the founding of modern Israel, expressions of anti-Semitism are still all too common, from Britain's Labour Party and America's Women's March to the Iranian regime and the United Nations Human Rights Council. Since I began writing on anti-Semitism half a century ago, I am still continuously confronted with the question, why? My answer has been that for accidental reasons, Jews have constantly found themselves opposing dominant ideologies of the times. Thousands of years ago, they bet on a religion drawing on a sacred book. The rest of the world was still illiterate. Keep that thought in mind, that the rest of the world was illiterate, because it does play a prominent role throughout the centuries. Continuing on, he says that the Jews were betting on oral traditions and local deities, that is, the rest of the illiterate public. Memories are mutable, and among illiterates lead to flexible behavior. In contrast, the literate religion anchored and guided people no matter where they found themselves, reluctant to acknowledge newer books. Starting with Antiochus Epiphanes around 170 BC, Hellenistic rulers complained that only Jews among all conquered nations refused to adopt Greek laws and beliefs. Both the Greek and later Roman and Christian authorities interpreted the Jews' adherence to their faith as a refusal to recognize the authority of the state. And skipping ahead a little, he goes on to say, in some places such as Spain, they disappeared, yet they survived in more tolerant lands. And skipping a little more to move on, talks about the exodus from Egypt when Jews became a nation only after overcoming the slave mentality. The matzah, unleavened bread, stands literally in the Exodus story for not having time to bake bread. But it is also a metaphor. The Jewish nation was only half-baked before leaving for the promised land. And one other thought that he leaves, which brings us to the Jews' disproportionate scientific, commercial, and financial successes. the culture of self-reliance has been a necessity. Well, that's from Mr. Professor um, Brenner. I would like to just throw out one more portion of a speech given by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. He made this speech, presented it as a keynote address on the question of the future of the Jewish communities in Europe, a conference that was held at the European Parliament on September 27, 2016 in Brussels. He said, and I'll quote a little more extensively, "The hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. That is what I want us to understand today. It wasn't Jews alone who suffered under Hitler. It wasn't Jews alone who suffered under Stalin. It isn't Jews alone who suffer under ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Islamic Jihad. We make a great mistake if we think anti-Semitism is a threat only to Jews. It is a threat first and foremost to Europe and to the freedoms it took centuries to achieve. Anti-Semitism is not about Jews. It is about anti-Semites. It is about people who cannot accept responsibility for their own failures and have instead to blame someone else. Historically, if you were a Christian at the time of the Crusades, or in German after the First World War, and you saw that the world hadn't turned out the way you believed it would, you blamed the Jews. That is what is happening today, and I cannot begin to say how dangerous it is. Not just to Jews, but to everyone who values freedom, compassion, and humanity. The appearance of anti-Semitism in a culture is the first symptom of a disease, the early warning sign of collective breakdown. If Europe allows anti-Semitism to flourish, that will be the beginning of the end of Europe. And what I want to do in these brief remarks is to simply analyze a phenomenon full of vagueness and ambiguity, because we need precision and understanding to know what anti-Semitism is, why it happens, why anti-Semites are convinced that they are not anti-Semitic. First, let me define anti-Semitism. Not liking Jews is not anti-Semitism. We all have people we don't like. That's okay. That's human. It isn't dangerous. Second, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism. I was recently talking to some school children and they asked me, is criticizing Israel anti-Semitism? I said no, and I explained the difference. I asked them, do you believe you have a right to criticize the British government? They all put up their hands. Then I asked, which of you believes that Britain has no right to exist? No one put up their hands. Now you know the difference, I said, and they all did. Anti-Semitism means denying the right of Jews to exist collectively as Jews with the same rights as everyone else. It takes different forms in different ages. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because of their religion. In the 19th and early 20th century, they were hated because of their race. Today, they are hated because of their nation state, the state of Israel. It takes different forms, but it remains the same thing. The view that Jews has no right to exist as free and equal human beings. And then he goes on to talk. If you hear a train whistle, it's my phone ringtone. He makes an analogy between anti-Semitism and a virus which continually mutates in terms of the different rationales as to why Jews were hated in different generations. So that's kind of, my opening to maybe touch a couple of phrases or words that may resonate with you. And before I get a little bit deeper in this, I'm going to ask Bob if he would start with the reference to South Pacific. In this video, which was made with Mitzi Gaynor, who plays the role of, um, yeah, just flown out of my head. Um, she's as corny as Kansas in August, of course. Um, and she plays the role of Nellie Furbish, the Navy nurse, who falls in love with, on the Broadway show, it was Ezio Pinza, who sang Some Enchanted Evening. Well, she falls in love with him, this French plantation owner, who had a previous marriage to a Polynesian woman, and he had children with her. And Nellie sees these children, and they are darker skinned than she is. And she cannot accept these children, even though she was prepared to marry Emile. And without further explanation, she simply breaks off her relationship with the Emile and runs away, leaving Emile and Lieutenant Cable, the scion of a prominent Philadelphia law firm. And he says, what's going on? Why can't she accept these children? And what you're about to see is a very simple song from South Pacific that Lieutenant Cable sings to explain what hatred is.
Okay. That's not it. Okay, here you go, from South Pacific.
I wasn't picking up on that. Bob, did everybody see the song?
So,
Essentially, and I would
Okay.
sing it if I had the lyrics, but he tells Emile, you've got to be taught to hate. You've got to be painfully taught or carefully taught. And he explains to Emile as best he can that hatred is a matter of what you learned as a child, and where certain things were drummed into your head. You've got to be painfully taught. It's probably 2 minutes out of a 2-hour presentation. But it is one of the things that Rogers and Hammerstein always did with their musicals. There was always some kind of a social message. And so let's just say that we're dealing with the broader concept of hate when we deal with anti-Semitism. And the reasons that people assign for hating other people, it's simply a basic foundation for what I'm about to say tonight and the next couple of Mondays as well, that we're dealing with a particular kind of hatred. So let us move on. Is there any kind of a response? I see maybe there's a chat commentary there. Bob, is there?
Just Mario Lanza was the person singing. I think that was the comment.
Actually, it was Rosanna Brazzi.
Okay.
Well, so how far back do you want to go? Well, I would suggest we start with ancient Egypt. And in the 5th century before the Common Era, there was a Jewish garrison billeted on the Nile River on the island of Elephantine. And it was there because of a compact between the Pharaoh at the time and Manasseh, king of Judah. The purpose of the garrison was to help the Egyptian garrison protect the southern border of Egypt from Nubian invaders. And there was a museum show that traveled throughout this country about 30 years ago, dealing with Elephantine. And it is also the subject of an introduction from Simon Schama, the Jewish British historian, in a 2-volume work that he's written called The Story of the Jews, which was also presented on PBS. And perhaps we could show that at this time, Bob.
All right, I'm going to try and do that. And let's see if I can make that happen.
Thank you.
Bear with me and I'll see if you can see that. Let's see, can you see South Pacific on the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, that's good. We're not going to show that again. So let me get out of that. And so we can get Simon Sharma's here. Get him on screen. Come on. All right, can you see Simon?
Good start.
You can see him?
The story of, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to play him. You should be able to hear this. Tell me, if you can't hear it, let me know.
Bob, nobody is seeing anything.
We're not having much success with that. Why don't I go ahead, Bob? Uh, Simon Sharma,
You're not seeing the screen?
no,
You're not seeing the picture?
correct.
Okay, I am screen sharing. Let me try one other thing. Let me try one other thing. Bear with me here. I'm sorry. No, that's not it. I'm seeing it, but you're not. Hang on. Not sure why you're not seeing it. Okay, I'll stop. If you're not seeing it, I'll stop sharing and let you speak to it.
Okay. So Sharma makes the following points. If you can imagine that to a certain extent, the Jews at the garrison and their Egyptian compatriots got along quite well. They interacted with them in their own communities. There was a Jewish temple on the same street or avenue as a important temple to the chief god of the Egyptians, Khnum, Khum. Khnum had the head of a ram and the body of a man. And in the panoply of Egyptian deities, he was their chief god. The Jewish garrison was present for over 100 years. And things got a little bit difficult after about 80 years or so. Around 410 before the Common Era, when the Egyptians discovered that there were bones of lambs found outside of the Jewish temple, and they realized that the Jews were sacrificing lambs at the time of Passover. They were outraged because the Jews were sacrificing the holy animals that the Egyptians venerated. And they destroyed the temple. One of the interesting things is that they actually had an altar and they had sacrificial services or worship by incinerating animals on the altar of the temple. It was a revelation when I learned that Jerusalem was not the only place where this happened. But the authorities in Jerusalem did restore the temple, but not with the altar for sacrificial animals after this particular incident. It's significant that there had been an uprising of the Egyptians around 425 before the Common Era, when the Persians controlled their country. And the Jews did not participate in this revolt. So you could say that the Egyptians were unhappy with the Jewish presence because the Jews did not join in this effort to throw off the yoke of Persian governments. But the main point was the religious one. And the Egyptians did not like the Jews because their religion was disrespectful of their religion. And as a result, it was an example, one of the earliest that I could find, of the antipathy between a native people and Jews in their presence. About 100 years thereafter, a Greek historian living in Egypt by the name of Hecataeus wrote a book called Egyptiaca, which essentially was a history of the Egyptian people. And he mentioned the Jews in relation to their presence in Egypt. And he made some very serious charges against the Jews and the way in which they conducted themselves. And basically, he claimed that the Jews did not respect the gods of other people, that they were different. In addition to their disdain for Egyptian gods, which in and of itself was an offense, they had strange practices. They had a Sabbath, a day of rest. They were monotheists, as opposed to believing in a whole panoply of gods. They abstained from eating certain foods, which we understand to be the laws of kashrut. And there were several other distinguishing features of the Jewish religion. This wasn't anti-Semitism, it was really anti-Judaism. And one of the texts that I have relied on is called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition by David Nirenberg. It is a very helpful book because it tells us that nations have a narrative about how they have come to be. And in their narrative, the Jews were a disturbing presence. Also, our story of the Exodus can be read as a victory of monotheism over polytheism, and that didn't sit well with the Egyptians. So the narratives of the Egyptian people are bound up with antipathy toward Jews because of that experience. And there were some other factors as well, but suffice it to say that the Jews were alien. They were the other. And when you have that situation throughout any generation, you will find that this is a cause of basic hatred and misunderstanding. And a more modern counterpart, Ali Hersey, the Somalian-born member of the Dutch legislature, a few years ago wrote an op-ed piece asking the question with regard to the American member of the House of Representatives, Ilhan Omar, when she made comments about it's the Benjamins, baby, making specific reference, questioning Jews' dual loyalties, perhaps, and the fact that the Jews really rooted for Israel over the interest of America. Of course, there was a firestorm, and Ali Hersey's op-ed piece was entitled, "Can Ilhan Omar lose her hatred or lose her anti-Semitism," I think is how it was called. And basically she said this. She said, "I understand her. I grew up in Somalia, as did she. And as a child, I can remember my grandmother cooking at the stove. And if she burnt her hands, she'd curse the Jews. If something else happened that she didn't like, she cursed the Jews." And her comment about it was that if your ideology is based upon a hatred of another people, and you blame them for everything, the big and the little disappointments in life, and it's pretty hard to lose that hatred. And that's essentially the picture that she presented in her op-ed piece. Whether or not Ilhan could be believed when she apologized, well, perhaps not, because like a couple of weeks thereafter, she made some other comment. And this brings to mind the phrase from the Hanukkah song, "Who can retell the things that befell us? Who can count them? In every age, a hero or sage came to our aid." And of course, it refers to the oppression and the trashing of our temple by Antiochus. And it brings to mind the whispering of Haman to Ahasuerus in his statements, which I will quote from our David Nirenberg text on anti-Judaism. So let me back up a little bit with regard to the statements about Hecataeus and give you a little more information about him. As I mentioned before, he was a first-generation Greek historian who traveled to Egypt with Alexander the Conqueror's group. He didn't speak Egyptian, and he didn't have much access to the traditions perceived by the Egyptian priests in their temples and in their memories. However, in his history, which he wrote about 320 before the Common Era, it was the first close encounter of Greek historical writing with Egyptian wisdom. And Nirenberg quotes Hecataeus as follows: "The common people ascribe their troubles to the workings of a divine agency, for indeed, with many strangers of all sorts dwelling in their midst and practicing different rites, their own traditional observances in honor of the gods had fallen into disuse. At once, therefore, the aliens were driven from the country. The most outstanding and active among them banded together, and as some say, were cast ashore in Greece and certain other regions. But the greater numbers were driven into what is now called Judea, and which is not far distant from Egypt, and was at that time utterly uninhabited. The colony was headed by a man called Moses, outstanding both for his wisdom and for his courage. This is kind of interesting in that there isn't a lot of evidence on the ground archaeologically that could prove the Exodus. But if you've got a historian quoting from Egyptian sources and then presenting it in his story of Egypt, the difference here is that the Jews were expelled. They weren't allowed to leave Egypt as according to Jewish tradition. So as part of the memories of the scribes and priests in Egypt, the Jews were kicked out of Egypt. The regard that the Egyptian traditions have for the role of Moses and others is quite different from our own. And this is often a way in which nations create their narratives to describe their superiority to those who they hate. In addition to this reference about being expelled, Hecataeus also said that Moses founded a new religion and he banned the worship of images. Quoting, he says, being of the opinion that God is not in human form, rather the heaven that surrounds the earth is alone divine and rules the universe. In addition to their iconoclasm, Hecataeus found Moses' people noteworthy for their nastiness, for as a result of their own expulsion from Egypt, he, meaning Moses, introduced an unsocial and intolerant mode of life. And I submit to you that this is one of the basic foundations of anti-Semitism today, that it got started as far back as Egypt and then got brought to modern times throughout the centuries by those who essentially repeated the same characteristics or traits that the Jews supposedly gave evidence of. So Nuremberg asked the question, does ancient Egypt bear the full responsibility for the invention of what would become a fundamental concept of anti-Judaism, that is Jewish misanthropy, or is Greece complicit? Now that's a rhetorical question, I think, and I won't attempt to answer it. The point of it is that we're dealing with something that occurred some 2,500 years ago. And I think we see the evidence today. It's what Lieutenant Cable said, you've got to be painfully taught. So as far back as Hecataeus in ancient Egypt, there is a narrative of Jewish nastiness and unsocial and intolerant mode of life. Nuremberg goes on to talk about the literal truth of Hecataeus' history matters less for us than for two interrelated facts. The first is that in order to compose it, he seems to have drawn on, among other things, an Egyptian version of the Exodus story, one in which the Hebrews are not liberated but expelled from Egypt, whence they emerge as enemies of the gods and of all other peoples. And the second is that the genre into which he translated these traditions, that of Greek history writing, gave them new reach, newly authoritative meaning. So Nuremberg then goes on to describe the crafting of an anti-Jewish cosmology. And then he gets to Manetho. Manetho was a priest who came about 200 years thereafter. And he repeated what we have just recited and then goes on. And this has become essentially the Egyptian tradition characterization of Jews. And it has proved remarkably stable throughout all time. So there are 5 points that he makes here. The Jews are a people once driven out of Egypt. 2, their practices are diametrically opposed to those of all other peoples, especially Egyptians and Greeks. 3, they are enemies of all the gods. 4, whenever and wherever they rule brutally and tyrannically. And 5, they are misanthropes, enemies not just of Egypt, but of all mankind. Doesn't that sound kind of modern? I mentioned Haman before. According to the story of Esther, in the Hebrew version of the story, so familiar to modern Jews from the celebration of Purim, the wicked Haman tells King Ahasuerus, dispersed in scattered groups among the peoples throughout the provinces of your realm, there is a certain people whose laws are different from those of every other people. They do not observe the king's laws, and it does not befit your majesty to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an order be drawn up for their destruction. Well, Nuremberg's point, I think, is as current today as it was 2,500 years ago. Are there any questions at this point? I see there are a number of items on the chat. Bob, could you field some of those for me?
I think the chat, I'll double check, was more of the issue that the screen share didn't work. So it it's not that I have current questions for you.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll be able to do something about that between now and next week.
I hope so.
Just because I think something in the nature of a video is, as I say, it brings a different voice, a different input into our story. Let's continue with this mode here. I mentioned that Manetho kind of repeated what had been said before, and it goes on to a fellow named Appian. But before we talk about Appian, let's talk about Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus was in the first century of the Common Era, a Jewish general who was defeated and surrendered to Vespasian when the Romans conquered the ancient kingdom of Israel, or Judea. And he was a very impressive, learned man, and found favor in the eyes of Titus, who brought him to Rome, put him on a pension, where Josephus wrote on the antiquities of the Jews and also on the wars of the Jews. At that point in his life, he took on the calumnies raised by Appian, another Greek, commenting on how bad the Jewish people were. And Josephus wrote a tract called Contra Appionum, that is against Appian. And he describes one of the other lies about the Jewish people arising during the rule of Antiochus. So when Antiochus's forces took over Jerusalem, he found on a couch in the temple, a man was reclining with a table before him laden with a banquet of fish of the sea, beasts of the earth, and birds of the air, at which the poor fellow was gazing in stupefaction. The king's entry was instantly hailed by him with adoration, as about to procure him profound relief. Falling at the king's knees, he stretched out his right hand and implored him to set him free. The king, referring to Antiochus, reassured him and bade him tell who he was, why he was living there, what was the meaning of his abundant fare. Thereupon, with sighs and tears, the man in a pitiful tone told the tale of his distress. He said that suddenly he was a Greek and that while traveling about in the province for his livelihood, he was suddenly kidnapped by men of a foreign race and conveyed to the temple. There he was shut up and seen by nobody, but was fattened on feasts of the most lavish description. At first, these unlooked for attentions deceived him and caused him pleasure, but suspicion followed. Then consternation. Finally, on consulting the attendants who waited upon him, he heard of the unalterable law of the Jews, for the sake of which he was being fed. The practice was repeated annually at a fixed season. They would kidnap a Greek foreigner, fatten him up for a year, and then convey him to a wood, where they slew him, sacrificed his body with their customary ritual, partook of his flesh, and while immolating the Greeks swore an oath of hostility to the Greeks. The remains of their victim were then thrown into a pit. The man, Appian, continues, because this is Appian's story about what the Jews did, stated that he had now but a few days left to live and implored the king, out of respect for the gods of Greece, to defeat this Jewish plot upon his lifeblood and to deliver him from his miserable predicament. Now, this was written in the 1st century of the Common Era. And in effect, it foreshadows the blood libels, the first of which was in 1144 with William of Norwich in England. It seems as though after Josephus, in his argument against Appian, Tacitus, the Roman historian, picked up these stories and continued them and repeated them and wrote about them. And Cicero also made comments during the rise and prominence of Rome. So if we count the nations that we've ticked off over the centuries through lies and slanders, we have the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And essentially, what was accepted as history or the writings of others, we would call it, remember when we were kids, we'd play the game of telephone where there'd be three or four children sitting in chairs next to each other, and one would whisper in somebody's ear a message, and that person in turn would whisper what he or she thought she had received as a message to the third person, and the third person would speak to the fourth person in the same hushed tones. And of course, the message came out quite differently. And I think the repetition of these so-called historians, and there was a long list of them, but essentially they all kept repeating the same slanders without any kind of a question, and perhaps without any knowledge of what Jewish practices actually were, which is an interesting question. When Chaucer wrote the Prioress's Tale, which we will discuss later on this evening, there were no Jews in England. He wrote his tale at the end of the 14th century. Well, the Jews were kicked out of England in 1290 by Edward I. So who was he talking about? There are other counterparts in history. When we get to Shakespeare, the Jews had not yet been let back into England. They arrived under Cromwell at some point, perhaps in the 1640s. But The Merchant of Venice was written in the late 1500s, 1596 or 7, perhaps. There were no Jews in England at that time to speak of. So out of what ether did Shakespeare write about Jews? By the same token, how is it that Chaucer would comment on the practice of Jews? Well, they really didn't. They repeated the same kind of a story as Appian wrote about Jews feeding on non-Jews, whether they be Greeks or Christians, which is the whole basis of the blood libel. So, aside from the irrationality of it, you don't have to have a good reason to hate people, particularly if you've got a convenient excuse that Jews are cannibals. They're terrible people. Why is the hatred so great and for so long a period of time? Christianity brought its own spin, but before Christianity, there was anti-Judaism. So the Christians did not invent it. They embellished it. Any questions at this point?
Yes, Matt, I have some questions for you.
Sure.
Every historian has a reason for writing a slant, if you will. What slant, if you will, what was Hector's slant and what was he trying to prove? What was his need in saying this about the Jews?
I'm not a psychoanalyst. I think that it was very convenient for him to pick up on stories that he had heard as being in the greater entourage of Alexander the Great. And he arrived in Egypt and heard stories about the Jews. And he put his own spin on it. Honesty was not one of the reasons why he wrote as he did. What inner satisfaction he gave or had, I do not know. All I know is the fact of what he wrote and how he essentially perpetuated for another generation because there were Roman writers who came after him, as well as other Greek writers who essentially copied what he said. Apollonius is one, and there were 4 or 5 others whom Nuremberg mentions by name. But at that point, there were 5 or 6 contenders for passing on what they had heard from the Egyptians and passed on for future generations.
Okay. Will we see a similar trend as Jewish presence spreads further east into Mongolia, Asia, India, particularly countries that are not Christian or polytheistic?
Well, it's an interesting question. Give me a second. I have to get something that's on my one of my shelves. I got this in India, in the state of Kerala, which is the southernmost tip of the continent, where there was a significant Jewish presence in the 1600s. The Jews came to India with the Portuguese. In fact, on the Indian Ocean, there is a church at which graveyard Vasco da Gama was buried. They subsequently moved his bones and brought them back to Portugal. But the Jews were cartographers of eminence for the early sailors like Vasco da Gama. And they traveled to all lands. And what I have here is from the city of Cochin, there's a synagogue. And this is a facsimile of the copper plates of the quarter centenary from 1568 to 1968. So when my wife and I traveled to India, I was given this facsimile, the copper plates from the Magna Carta of the Jews of Cochin. No two scholars agree as to their dates in their translations. Some scholars maintain 11th century as the correct date, but the traditional date according to the Cochin Jews is 379 of the Common Era. The following translations are the one, and that the syntax is not right. The following translation is the one adopted by the Jews of Cochin. Hail and prosperity. The following gift was graciously made by him who had assumed the title of kings. His Majesty the King, Sri Pakaran Ravi Vanmar, whose ancestors have been wielding the scepter for many thousands of years. In the 36th year after the second year on the date on which he dwelt in the particular area, was pleased to make the following gifts. We have granted to Joseph Rabban, R-A-B-B-A-N, the village of Anjuvanam, together with the 72 proprietary rights, tolls on boats and carts, the revenue and the title of this town, the lamp of the day, a cloth spread in front to walk on, a palanquin, a parasol, etc., etc. We have granted him the land tax and weight tax. Moreover, we have sanctioned with these copper plates that he need not pay the dues which the inhabitants of other cities pay the royal palace, and that he may enjoy the benefits which they enjoy. To Joseph Rabban, the prince of Anjuvanam, whatever the name is, and to his descendants, sons and daughters, and to his nephews and to his sons-in-law who married his daughters in natural succession, so long as the world and moon exist. This town shall be his hereditary possession. Hail, with the knowledge of, and it has a number of names, chief of the Vanudu, chief of the Vanupalandu, chief of the Irilanadu, etc., etc. This essentially is a gift of land in perpetuity. So when Jews went to foreign countries in those days, They came respected for their adventuresomeness, and were granted certain rights and privileges, including non-taxable lands, on which they built their synagogue in Cochin in the state of Kerala in ancient India. This is a Mughal, M-O-G-U-L, a Mughal deed. So in answer to the question, as original venturers to new lands, they would pay their respects, and in many cases, they were accepted because there was no adverse influence in a written tradition or an oral tradition. In other words, the Jews entered with kind of like a tabula rasa, a clean slate. The slanders against Jews followed in years to come thereafter.
Right. I didn't have any other questions. Let me ask if there's anyone that would like to ask a question now and come off of mute and ask Matt something before we finish up this evening. Anyone have something you'd like to ask Matt? Okay, hearing none. Matt, you may want to summarize for this evening.
Yeah. The summation simply is that the concept of hate is part of mankind. The Jews have certainly had more than their share. And what was established in olden times has essentially plagued us for years and years to come. Next week, we'll talk about Christianity, the Gospels, and how they gave further impetus to the slanders against Jews, particularly in regard to the non-acceptance of Jesus. And of course, the crucifixion. We'll discuss that. We'll discuss the writings and sayings of certain church fathers, the adoption of Christianity by Constantine the Great. We'll deal with the Middle Ages and then bring it up to perhaps as far as the Dreyfus affair in France in 1894. And that will end next week's presentation. And the final presentation will deal with a number of things: the Leo Franks case, the St. Louis affair, and certainly World War II and the Holocaust, but to a more limited extent. So we could deal in some very current things and rather some delicate issues as to black anti-Semitism, Arab anti-Semitism, and things of that nature. So thank you for your attention.
That's a lot to cover. We've yet to go.
Hey, it ain't chopped liver.
So Matt, thank you very much for this evening's first presentation, and thank everyone else for joining us. I will work on figuring out why that videos, which I took time to put together, didn't work. Stumped by that for the moment. And maybe Matt, if you can stay on a little bit afterwards, I'll do a practice session with you. Maybe it'll work out.
Sounds great.
I wish you a wonderful good evening and a safe, pleasant week, and stay out of the rain.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone. Matt, hang on.
Thank you.
Will do.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you again.
Good night.
Matt, I'm going to try and screen share one more time.
Yes.
Hang on. Just hang on right there. Okay. Can you see, what do you see on my screen now?
The Temple Israel flyer on with my picture and anti-Semitism, the title
right.
of the,
So that you can see.
yes.
All right, let me try sharing something else. And let's see where I get here.
Bob, when I observed your cursor at the lower end of the screen,
Yes.
I started to pick up some of the sound from The Sound of Music. I'm sorry, South Pacific. Oh boy! So it's as if to say you almost had the sound but not the picture when the cursor was at the bottom of the screen. I don't know if that had anything to do with it.
I don't either. Let me try one other thing.
Yeah.
The document's not going to do it. Let's try here. All right. No, all right. You see Zoom on the screen right now? The word Zoom.
Yes, upper left-hand corner.
All right. I'm going to try
to the
and.
workplace with Zoom. Yeah.
All right. Tell me what you see now. You see Sound of Music picture?
No, I see. Except I see the word "yes, sir," the lower right-hand portion of the, and I can
Right.
see
That's actually in the picture. That's actually the lyric in print, but
yes.
you don't see the
No.
picture itself. That's interesting. So here you see my email.
Yeah,
You see that screen, but the video you're not seeing.
that is correct.
It's interesting. And here's the Simon Schachma's picture. You don't see anything now, right?
Nothing at all. Yes.
All right. So let me go to, if I can go to advanced sharing, see if that does anything. Advanced share. Basically go to advanced. Advanced printer portion, no music or computer sound. Background, no files. So it must be something that PowerPoint, no, basic. So this is basic. This you see. So I'm sharing that.
See the story of the Jews with Simon Schama.
You
No,
did see that?
I did see the title.
So the title, let me go back to that. So what you see the story of the Jews with Simon Sharma, right?
Correct, and I see the delta sign to start it.
Right, but you're not seeing the picture. That's interesting.
Yeah. If
All
you
right, so I have to learn what why a video is not showing up on the screen. It may have to do with resolution or something like that. I'll have to figure that out.
Bob, question for you.
Yes.
Could you put that back on again as you did a moment? Okay. You see the delta sign where you could click on to get it started?
Yes.
Try now. Click on that if you can with your cursor.
I'm seeing it on my screen. It's playing, but you're not seeing it on yours.
That is right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. I don't know why.
That's strange.
I don't know why the video is not playing. That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I'll have to do my homework to figure that out. There's an advanced share here. See if I can find that. No. No, it's invite. I don't want to do that. It does say you're sharing your screen. Well, I'm sharing it, but I'm not sharing a video. I can share something else. So I can share Zoom. You can see that, but you can't see the video.
That is correct.
All right. Well, that came as a surprise to me, an unfortunate surprise. I had no clue that would be the case.
Yeah.
Subtitles. Move this out of the way. Options. Good, better, best. Oh, that's best. Size. All right, I'm seeing it, but you're seeing nothing.
What was that sound? Was that the soundtrack coming through, but not the picture?
Yes, that's the sound. You're hearing the sound.
Okay.
You're not seeing a picture.
Yes, that is right. Yeah.
Very depressing. I worked hard to make this all perfect. I was thought it ready to go, and it played on my screen, so I figured it would play on yours. I have no clue why a video doesn't play. I'm sure there's some link that I'm not pressing for getting, and I'm not enabling the video to play.
Yeah,
I will have to figure that out.
okay.
All right, well, I'm sorry. I apologize. I had no clue that would be the case. I had no understanding as to why that would. Let me get out of this. Hang on a second. Stop sharing. Okay, there I am.
Well,
Yeah, no clue as to why that would be the case. And here's advanced sharing options. One participant can share, multiple participants, only host all participants. Who can share, only host? Let's see if this makes a difference. No, this shouldn't make any difference.
well, perhaps you can come up with a solution.
All right, I will work at it. And just one more brief second. Share this. And you still can't see anything, right?
That's correct.
All right, then I'll have to go do my homework on that. So
All
thank
right.
you for spending time with us this evening. We'll do same time, same place next week.
That
And
sounds-
I'll try to get the Merchant of Venice and actually make it work.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, have a great night, Matt.
You too. Good night.
Bye-bye.